Transcripts and recordings of the podcast may not be used for any purpose without the direct written permission of the podcast owner. Welcome to Light It Up, a podcast about resilient women balancing motherhood, their careers, personal lives, and all of the challenges that come along with being a superwoman. Each week, you'll be motivated to take action to lead, inspire, transform, and empower. Now, here's your host, Dr. Aginah M. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Light It Up. I am your host, Dr. Aginah M. I'm very excited about this week's episode because I have a guest who actually works in the mental health field. And you all know that I am a huge advocate about us taking care of our mental and emotional health. Today's guest is Chicago native Rachael Stewart. She is a licensed clinical social worker and the founder of Amaris Counseling, LLC. I'll let Rachael kind of talk about her background, but I guess I'll start off by saying that she does hold a Bachelor and Master of Social Work from Governor State University, which is actually right in my backyard here in South Suburban Illinois. And I'll let her give you all of her other credentials because she has quite a few. Welcome to the podcast, Rachael. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. We actually connected because you were recommended to me as a possible guest on the podcast because I was looking for someone who could talk about their journey for navigating, I guess, a successful co-parenting relationship. And through our conversations, I learned that you have your own practice. And I figured what a great way for us to kind of incorporate the two, talk about successful co-parenting relationships, as well as talk about healthy communication, making sure one takes care of their mental and emotional health. And so we're going to touch a couple of different topics today. But I just want to kind of preference that as we start out so that folks won't think that we're jumping all over the place. There is a method.
It's all going to tie together.
Right. It's all going to tie together. So there's a little bit of method to my madness. So why don't I just pause here and give you an opportunity to share with us a little bit about your background and how you got into how you decided to enter into the field of social work, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much for having me. I got into social work almost by accident. I went to college originally because I wanted to be some form of journalist. I wasn't sure what. I just knew I could communicate really well. And I didn't mind deadlines, didn't love them, but didn't mind them. And I took a social work class just as one of my gen eds, and I was hooked. I was like, wait, this is great. But I also feel like every person that's in this field, it's not a career, it's a calling. And I lost my mother at a very young age and have always had kind of an old soul, people tell me. And I think I've always been just graced with the gift of wisdom and counsel. And I always found that to be my role in my friend groups and my family. And so to me, it was a very natural transition to move from communicating via journalism to then communicating and helping other people learn how to communicate more effectively, process through things. Took some more psychology classes, and again was like, I love how the brain works. And I picked social work over psychology because psychology deals a lot with the internal, like what your brain is and all of that genetics, whereas social work looks at the holistic system, right? So it's not just everything that you were born with, but also how the systems around you interact with those, genes and, all of those. So that's how I got here. Do you want me to talk a little bit about the practice as well, or?
What I want to do is actually stop you there with, first, thank you for explaining the difference between the field of social work and psychology, because I think sometimes people, we know psychology is the study of the mind or what have you. but not really putting into perspective the importance or the significance of the field of social work in terms of the areas that are addressed.
Yeah.
So, as you pursued your undergrad degree and decided that social work was the right field for you, um, how did you did you enter into your own private practice first, or did you work um, for someone else and then make the decision to launch your practice?
So definitely the latter. I always told people, number one, I didn't know I was going to go into mental health. My undergraduate degree was, my undergraduate internship was in domestic violence, and so
Mm.
I thought I was going to do that. I thought I was going to work with the YWCA and maybe become like a rape advocate or something. And then my graduate internship, I was in community mental health, and I was like, this is it. I was terrified, but I had a really amazing supervisor who told me, Rachel, one day you're going to be a licensed clinical social worker. You can do this. And because we think about the severe and persistent mental illness like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder,
Mhm.
major depressive disorder, and it can be terrifying, but it's really just all about your clinical skills. And so I was like, you know what? I want to be a clinician. And so
Okay.
that's how I got there. I worked in community mental health. My resume is very eclectic. I have worked in for-profit healthcare. I've worked in, I actually currently work in hospice as well as doing my practice. I've worked in community mental health. So I've been kind of all over, but I did community mental health. I was in a group practice. And then during COVID, I was virtual with the group practice, and I was like, you know what? I just want to offer up to people a little bit of help and assistance. And people were like, are you going to have your own clients? And I was like, well, I guess I could, but I never
Yeah.
planned to. I said, maybe when I'm in my 40s, eventually I'll get there and everything. And God was like, no, let's go. So I said, all right. And so
Okay.
in the midst of the pandemic, decided to incorporate the business. And I thought I was just going to start with my couple little clients. And it went from me having 4 clients to now myself and 10 other clinicians and clinical interns,
Wow.
and this just amazing practice that God has been blessing. So it's been a journey in this almost 3 years.
I was going to say that is substantial growth
Yeah.
in a short period of time. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Um, so is your practice purely virtual, or do you see clients in
Purely
person?
virtual.
Okay. Okay. And I would imagine that also will open up the door for more people to connect with the clinician, because oftentimes if you're
Hmm.
trying to get from work and try and rush,
Right.
to get to an
Find
appointment.
babysitters, all of that.
Yeah.
And I actually have clients that I was working with before in person who now, and they have no desire to go back. But we do have, so like I also do trainings and speaking events and things like that. And so those are in person as well as
Mhm.
virtual. So there's a little bit of hybrid there, but the actual sessions are done virtually, which, like you said, it provides so much more flexibility.
Right, right. Perfect. Now, one thing that I did see and just noted from your experience in community mental health, and then the fact that you thought that you were going to go in one direction, you have you're a certified clinical trauma professional level 1 and
Mhm.
an EMDR trained clinician. Now,
Yeah.
for those of us who are laymen and we have no idea what that means, could you explain what these credentials mean and what does that allow you
Yeah.
to do in terms of your expertise?
For sure. So, a certified clinical trauma professional is basically just means I've taken additional certifications and training to work with those who experience trauma. We know that a lot of people have trauma, and so it just gives you a little bit of different interventions and tools to use for those who are presenting with that as their main issue. EMDR is one of my favorite interventions. It's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And basically, what it means is that it doesn't change the trauma that you've experienced it, but it changes how your brain processes it. So let's say if you had a really distressing event when you were 5, we might process that event. And if it was level 10 distressing to you, if we get it down to a 2, that's a really significant difference, right? And
Mhm.
it's done through something called bilateral stimulation, where through eye movement and all that. It's wonderful. I encourage everybody to look it up. One of the most fascinating things I've ever looked into. And there are not a lot of people of color who are
Mhm.
trained in it. And so that was one of my hearts too, is because one of my biggest hearts is for marginalized populations, like Black and Brown communities. And so I wanted to
Mhm.
make sure that, I trained myself to provide what our white counterparts get,
Mhm.
right?
Okay. Okay. That's very interesting because I think when you EMDR, I think I just had totally different thought process
Yeah.
of, and I'll tell you probably where my mind was going with the eye movement. I was like, are they assessing a person based upon eye movement in terms of whether or not there's a topic that may be triggering to them, or things of that nature. But
Yeah, and it's not hypnosis. A lot of people will think
okay.
like, "Oh, am I going into this hypnotic state?" Absolutely not. You're completely present in the moment.
Mhm.
The therapist is walking you through it, and it can be used in conjunction with talk therapy as well. So again, I
Okay.
just encourage there's a lot of really good informational videos that are on
Mhm.
YouTube. I usually send my clients before we start doing that type of work.
Okay. So, as you stated, you launched your practice in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. We
Yeah.
do have something in common. I launched my podcast in
Ah,
2020,
nice.
right before the pandemic. So, it caused me to do everything virtual, which was not the initial intent, but it just shows how we can pivot
Mhm.
during the course of crises. Um, your practice, Amaris, you focus on, or your specialization is anxiety, adjustment to life-changing events, adjustment to aging. That's interesting because I don't know. I'm in my mid 40s. I may be adjusting to that new age bracket.
Yeah.
Couples counseling, depression, divorce, and divorce adjustment. Now, I
Mhm.
know you also do faith-based counseling. We can kind of talk about that too, because for so many years, I think in particular in our community, we often steer clear of counseling, or I know people would say, especially if they were very religiously inclined, I'm gonna leave it
Mhm.
on the altar, I'm gonna leave it to Jesus or what
Right.
have you to work out my problems,
Mhm.
versus getting the professional help
Yeah.
that's needed. Um, let's start with first of all, how did you come up with the name Amaris?
Yeah. So it's so funny. So, and we'll probably get into it later, but in 2014, I was in the midst of beginning the separation process before my divorce, and I needed a car, and I was learning how to be independent of myself on my own. And literally, God did a creative miracle in my life and helped me to get this car and everything. And I just heard the name Amaris, and it means
Mhm.
promised by God by Hebrew. And I just felt like God was just sending me a little smile about this season of your life. Like, I got you. These are the promises. And so that was in 2014. So then
Mhm.
when I was looking for a name for my practice, he immediately brought that back and was like, If I promise these things to you, they're going to succeed. Right. And this is part of
Mhm.
your journey. So it was just kind of this beautiful confirmation for me of like, no, 2014, that was years ago, but here it is coming back again. And so, yeah, I believe that, it was definitely something that was promised by God. And I believe we each have different promises. And so that was, kind of the heart of the mission and core values of Amaris.
Okay. I love that. I absolutely love that. Um, so you mentioned that you were going through a separation process and divorce. And one of the things that I wanted to focus on with this particular episode is related to co-parenting and even, divorce adjustment, to be
Yeah.
perfectly honest. I too have gone through a divorce. Now that I think about it, it was the same time. I filed for a
Wow.
divorce in 2013 and it was final in 2013.
Wow.
And one of the things that, and I'll say this just from a personal experience, because I know being transparent with people is very, very important. And I would venture to say that it's also probably important to people if they are seeking someone to help them navigate this particular time in their life. It may very well be important that the person can relate to their experience.
Yeah.
Um, I've heard people say, "Well, you can't really, you know." give me advice or make suggestions if you don't understand my experience, so to speak. So having gone through a divorce myself, I've had people that ask me, well, how did you come to the decision to make, how did you come to the decision of, going through a divorce? And
Mhm.
I honestly, I was meeting with my counselor
Mm.
and we were talking about, I was experiencing a tremendous amount of stress, anxiety. I was just not happy with the things that were going on
Mhm.
personally within my marriage. And I went through this exercise like over the period of the sessions where I started writing in a journal. This was one of the recommendations.
Love
Um,
journaling.
yeah, that my therapist gave me. And what I find to be so beautiful about journaling is that I can go back
Mhm.
and read what I was going through and just kind of process how far I've come
Yeah.
from that point in time in my life. So through the help of counseling, going to counseling, I guess, I feel that I developed the courage to go ahead and make that move of filing for a divorce because my situation, I was very concerned about what my family would think, in particular, my parents,
Mhm.
what my religious community would think, because I was born and raised as a Muslim, so I practice Islam. And
Mhm.
so divorce is not necessarily, something that,
Mhm.
is promoted.
Yeah.
And so it was a huge challenge for me to make that decision. But through counseling, I realized I had to start living my life for myself and not to make other people happy or live my life for someone else. So for someone who is, I guess, struggling in the area within their relationship, marriage,
Mhm.
what have you, how do you how do you think your experience may play a role in how you work with your clients? Do you have a certain level of empathy? You know, obviously you can't, share certain things,
Right.
but do you think that based upon your own personal experience that it has helped you to yeah, more informed or I guess empathetic?
Yeah, for sure. I think, like you said, so I mean, I use self disclosure when appropriate, but I think the
Mhm.
biggest thing is that it helps me to help them to be an advocate, to have a voice, right? I
Mhm.
think that's one of the things in a lot of marriage, and I think especially I see for women and Black women specifically, is that we can sometimes lose ourselves in the roles that we have, right? So whether it's wife, whether it's mom, whether it's, all the different roles that we play. And I think that was some of my lived experience, right? Is that I
Mhm.
was this complete person I didn't recognize in that marriage, right? And so
Mhm.
being able to identify that has helped me to help others, recognize that in myself, like, who are you outside of this role that you're playing? Who are you? And if that doesn't align with who you want to be and where you want to be, there's either a conversation about we need to make these changes, or maybe this doesn't fit for the
Mhm.
season that we're in, right? I'm a, practicing Christian, and that's something, again, like you said, I can definitely identify with. Divorce is not very, it's
Right.
not, it's a little bit more well received now,
Mhm.
but it used to be just like, if you're not getting beat, or if you're not, then that's
Yes.
it, right? And it's like,
Right.
no, so abuse, number one, takes so many different types of forms, right? It's not just physical abuse,
Mhm.
there's spiritual abuse, verbal abuse, all those things. But also it could just be we're not a good fit, and where our futures are going, they don't line up, and I don't feel like myself, all of these different reasons. So I think the biggest thing that I, can help facilitate is just who are you, and the identity piece. And that's why I always advocate for premarital counseling and even marital counseling, because you have to know a lot of these things before you even get into a marriage. Otherwise, that's when we start falling into that statistic of,
Mhm.
50% of marriages ending in divorce.
Right. I think that is very important. The premarital counseling. I don't know how many of us actually go through premarital
Mhm.
counseling, or if maybe we leave it to our our religious institutions to go to
Mhm.
premarital counseling or not. But for someone who is, I guess, what are the I guess, areas of focus when one is going through premarital counseling? Is it the communication piece? Is it talking about your unique backgrounds as individuals and then
Mhm.
how you will come together as one?
Yeah, it's
'Cause
everything. So
yeah.
I kind of created my own little curriculum. I pull on a couple of different, things. I use the Gottman approach. John and Julie Gottman, they're really great
Mhm.
relationship and marriage experts in the field. But I pretty much talk about everything. So we're going to talk about finances, right? We're going to talk about what are your beliefs in your relationship with money? How does that impact your relationships? We're going to talk about spirituality. We're going to talk about, child rearing. If you want children, if you don't, how does that work? And I mean all of those things, communication, sex, all those things, and even for people they're like, oh, okay, I'm a virgin, I don't, you can still talk about sex without having sex, right?
Right.
So all of the different areas that are going to make up the relationship. And so many people, like I said, they're like astounded because they're like, well, we never talked about this stuff. Even something as simple as one of my first assignments is, when's the last time you did the love languages quiz, by Gary
Mhm.
Chapman? Have
Yep.
you done the love languages quiz? And not only that, there's an apology languages quiz that a
Mm.
lot of people don't know about, right? So if
Mhm.
you don't know your apology language, then you might never have good communication just off of that alone, right? So a lot of it is communication, but also talking about those, things that can be hard conversations, right? Talking about money can be really hard, but the sooner you do it, then it's not going to be 5, 10 years into the relationship or the marriage that now, okay, we're running into these issues because we just didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Tell people you
You
don't have to be engaged to start premarital counseling. I have a couple right now I'm working with, they're dating, and they're just trying to prepare for it, so it can start as soon as you realize, I think I might want a future with this person. So let's start having these conversations.
so glad that you said that because that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Do you recommend at a certain what stage in the relationship would one go through premarital counseling? And kudos to the couple who are doing it early
Yeah.
because it's certainly, I can see where it will save a person a lot of time,
Mhm.
money, and heartache,
Yeah.
because you may discover through that premarital counseling that maybe, you know, you need to either make some adjustments, see if you can compromise on some things, or determine that maybe this isn't a good fit. But it is amazing some of the topics that we don't discuss when we're involved in intimate relationships
Right.
that either we ignore. I can tell you for myself, having gotten married over 20 years ago, I am very honest when I say to people that I thought that I could change my husband.
Mhm. Wow.
And I think that a lot, I don't know about now, but during my era, because I got married when I was in my early 20s.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think that mindset of, oh, well, I can change him or get him to do XYZ. And no, you can't change anyone.
People can change, but you
People can
can't
change,
change
but
people.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Either they need to realize that there's a change that they need to make.
Mhm.
Um, because otherwise, if you think that you can force a person, then you're mistaken. And
Yeah.
there were some areas that um and I know, I think as I've dated, since my divorce, I know what are deal breakers for me,
Yeah.
which are totally different from when I was in my 20s. So
Exactly.
the things that maybe were a deal breaker then, perhaps I thought I could compromise on, but after experiencing several relationships, I
Mhm.
know, nope, this is
Yep.
something that I cannot compromise. No way. So why even go go
Yeah.
through it?
And that's such an important
Yeah.
conversation that a lot of people just don't have. They're kind of like, oh, especially this generation, they're like, well, we're just going to wait and see. We're just seeing what happens. And I'm like, but you're not having these intentional conversations. So,
Right.
well, then when it happens, then what? What backup
Right.
plan do you have? How are you guys going to work through this? And I think that's what we're seeing too. A lot of very like quick relationships, right? People aren't making
Mhm.
it past 3 months, 6 months because they're not having these hard conversations. And then conflict arises and then they're not prepared to work through it.
Yeah. That is something. So let's kind of transition to this notion of co-parenting.
Mhm. For
Some of us don't have successful co-parenting relationships. And then there are some people who do. And I have to be honest with you, I am absolutely fascinated by those who have great co-parenting relationships. Now, I do understand I'm not naive enough to think that these relationships started out
right.
positively, because let's face it, oftentimes, well, you're going to either have one or two situations when you're talking about a co-parenting relationship. You'll have a situation where either there was one party in the relationship that decided that they wanted the relationship to end, and
Mhm.
the other person was in non-agreement,
Right.
or you have a situation where both parties, concluded that they weren't a right fit,
Right.
and they had these children or a child together. And perhaps from the onset, because they were in agreement that they weren't able to maintain their relationship, perhaps they started out with a great co-parenting relationship.
Right.
Um, from your training and your experience, I guess I'll start with, why do some co-parenting relationships break down? I mean, I have my thoughts
Mhm.
about it, but I'm curious to
Yeah.
know, what your thoughts are.
So I think that similar to what you said, a lot of it is there might be some resentment that's going on, and I think so when I went through my divorce, you had to go to like a child raising, seminar or
Mhm.
something together, and we had to attend these classes, but they really didn't dive deep into the emotional part of it. And I wish I did not go through counseling when I was in the midst of going through my divorce. I
Mhm.
wish that I would have, because I think, I mean, I talked to a counselor, but I wasn't like actively, it was kind of like on the latter end of it. But I
Okay.
think that there were so many unresolved emotions when I was going through mine. And I think that is a huge factor as to
Mhm.
why you can't communicate, because you still hurt. You can't
Yeah.
communicate because you are bitter, you're resentful of the person, maybe you're angry and you have unresolved anger and you don't know how to communicate it. Or when you do try to communicate it, the other person just isn't receptive, or maybe they've moved on and they're like, look, I don't have anything to talk about, right? So there's so many different factors I think that can play into that. But I think a lot of it could just be, if you guys aren't in a good place to communicate, then that's going to be the number one thing. And then it turns away the attention from the child or the children to, it's about y'all, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so you're going to get into more of that successful communication when you're focusing on the child, and not, it has to be two separate things. This is what we got going on and how we need to
Mhm.
communicate, but this is how we come together, because we have to view ourselves as a team. Not everybody is ready to be a team though, right? Because a
Yeah.
team takes some level of interaction and teamwork and everything. And like, to be transparent, it took me a while to get there.
Mhm.
I would say we were separated in 2014. Our divorce was final in 2015. We got into a groove maybe by 2018.
Okay, so
Took
it
some
took
time.
you, yeah, that took some time.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, speaking for myself, it's been 10 years and we still don't co-parent. I
Yeah.
am the parent. Um, which is interesting. Well, I'll in my experience, my ex-husband asked me if I wanted a divorce.
Mhm.
I said yes, and he didn't think I was going to go through with it. So he
Mhm.
didn't want the divorce,
Okay.
but I always say, be careful what you ask for
Yeah, absolutely.
or what you ask, and he did not participate. So I didn't have what I would say the benefit of going through any type of like child rearing
Mm.
class with him. Um, I did everything, unfortunately, because he was not an active participant.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, I still remember him saying to me, if you want this divorce, then you pay for it.
Mm.
And that's what I did,
Yeah.
not realizing that I was going to be throwing money, you know, not so much as down the drain, because I did have representation.
Mhm.
But when it's one sided and you don't have anyone that is participating. And so I think that caused for us a huge issue in our ability to co-parent because he was not an active participant
Right.
in the dissolution of our marriage. And all I asked, honestly, like I put together with my attorney the parenting agreement, said, here you go.
Mhm.
He reviewed it, he signed it, he agreed to it, but then didn't follow through
Okay.
on his end. And so I will acknowledge, and I've shared with him, I do have resentment about that.
Yeah.
So my resentment is based upon the fact that here we have three amazing children. I think they're amazing. And all I really want you to do is co-parent. Like,
Mhm.
I'm never going to keep you away from your children. I'm not one of those individuals, I just want you to be present, be an active, you know,
Mhm.
partner in terms
Right.
of parenting. That was non-existent.
Yeah.
So we are unable 10 years later to really communicate. Communication is via text
Mm.
or via email.
Mhm.
Out of the 10 years we've been divorced, we've been in court at least 8 of the 10 years. We
Wow.
just had our last court date, September 1st, 2022.
Oof. What a journey.
That's exhausting.
Yeah.
And so I feel um, that while I made the decision to end the marriage, I don't want to use the term stuck,
Mhm.
but I have been stuck with raising three children solo,
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
without I'm participating in report card parent teacher conferences,
Mhm.
none of that. So there's my level of resentment.
Yeah. It can, and I actually had a very different experience, but it resulted in the same kind of resentment too. So I was on the opposite end where I felt like maybe we could have worked through some things. He wanted
Mhm,
to end the relationship, but then it was on me, kind of like he was cool to just kind of hang out. And I was like, look, I need to be able to move on with my life. If we're not doing this, then what? And I
mhm,
had to file, do everything. Thankfully, ours was very inexpensive because we were very young, had no assets. It was kind of just like, look, we did all of our information. And even now, like, any paperwork we have, we've never been to court. We filed all of our stuff, but we have, anytime we write something up, we write it up, sign it, get it notarized. Cool, we're done.
mhm,
Um, but it was he is kind of a mama bear. I call him a mama bear because he's one of those people, like, which I'm grateful for, because I feel like my daughter has a very active father, which you don't
mhm,
often see. Well,
mhm.
you see it way more often than not, because there's a
Right.
lot of amazing Black dads out there.
Yeah.
But it was kind of like, so people really questioned me of like, well, why don't you have her every day? Well, why don't you do? And so what I faced was a lot of resentment because it didn't look like how I wanted it to look. Like, number one, he began a new relationship very soon after we were separated, and I was just like, well, all of us need to be this team. I'm like kind of maybe Susie Sunshine, and I was like, we could all be this team, we could do birthday parties together, we could do this. And he was like, well, I can't make her. And and so I was just
Mhm,
like, but it's about her. It's like, this is what, so it created a lot of resentment because I was, number one, hurt, and being like, okay, you said you weren't gonna move on, you moved on, cool, well, now what do we do? But I think also just realizing, and this is where I had to do a lot of self-work, or realizing he had a lot of control and exerted a lot of power and control. And so I felt very powerless in the beginning of our
mhm,
situation. I also felt powerless financially because
mhm,
he had now two people that were contributing to his household, and it was just me. And so
mhm,
I often would lose a lot of privileges, as far as like, oh, I can't keep her, so she's staying with you because I have to work two jobs, or I have to do all these
mhm,
things. And so I was over here kind of like, on the struggle bus, and
mhm,
people were like, again, well, Rachel, what you doing? Why you're not, and so number one, I would tell people every co-parenting journey, it's not going to look the same, and so
mhm,
you have to define what your co-parenting journey looks like and be okay with what it looks like, no matter what other people say. Because my thing was like, you want me to have my kid, but you gonna pay for childcare? We figured out what worked for us. We went through a period where we were only talking via email, because every time we got on the phone, it was very tense, and we were,
mhm.
saying words, and so we was like, okay, look, we need documentation, because we can't just go off of verbal communication. So we need it
Right.
documented. And now, again, we can now, I still I think just out of protection and from past things, I will still document important things just so I can make sure. But we have a lot more communication where I can call and just be like, hey, I know you got to pay for gymnastics. Can I send it to you in 2 weeks or something? So we
Mhm.
have a better communication about that. But again, it took a lot of time when I went through the process of getting remarried and all of that, and now having another co-parenting. That was a whole thing. We had to get readjusted to. But we just figured out. I think who I am in my profession definitely helped just because I was like, I know how to communicate, right? And I know that I know the end game and I know the end result that I want. And so even if he's not fully signed on to the vision that I have, I'm gonna do my part. And so I
Mhm.
think I have just let a lot of things go over the years, and not in a passive way, but just in a, is it going to matter to my daughter? Like, my daughter has always been the primary focus, right? And so
Mhm.
I think that was the one thing where that made our relationship successful and continues to, is that we both love her very fiercely, and we're like, look, I'm gonna be around no matter what,
Mhm.
so we have to figure out how to do this so that we both can be around.
Wow. I have no words. Because I think what I'm thinking about is what's important really is the child,
Mhm.
right? And putting the child first.
Yeah.
But as adults, we can allow our egos
Hmm.
and our feelings to get in the way and then lose sight of really who's important here.
Absolutely.
And then if you don't address, I think, your feelings or the fact that you're hurt or resentful or what have you, then it does obviously create a barrier for you to be able to
Yeah.
co-parent. Because yeah.
Yeah. And coming out of the belief, I know one of the biggest things I think for both of us that we learned, he had to realize I wasn't the same person that he married, because we got married when I was 21. So
Okay.
now we're at the place where this is almost 12 years later. So we're at the place where it's like, look, we're both in our 30s. We are completely different people, as we
Mhm.
should be.
Mhm.
But I think he had to let go of the idea of, I'm not the same person you married. I'm not even the same person that you divorced.
Mhm.
Now we're on the end of, like, it's years and years later. I'm totally different. I'm in this new relationship, all of that. And I also have to let go of that, because I used to almost go into our conversations expecting him to react the way he did when we were married, or expecting him to
Mhm.
react the way he did when we were divorced. And I actually had to apologize. Like, I'm sorry, because I'm already going into this prejudging you, and I'm thinking that you're
Mhm.
gonna act this way, and you're not. And so we had to now create this new relationship with who we are now. And that was very freeing, because I used to have so much apprehension and so much anger and all, and I'm just like, wait, if I want him to believe I'm not the same, I have to extend that same grace to him. And that
Mhm.
was very transformative. Took some time, but I will say confidently now, I feel a lot different about our communication than I did, like I said, even 5 years ago when, my husband and I first got together.
So what tips then can you give as far as like the communication piece? Like I know that while I don't have an extensive training in the proper way to communicate like your feelings and your thoughts,
Yeah.
but if I draw from when I used to teach peer mediation and conflict
Mhm.
resolution of
Mhm.
all things,
Yeah.
and you talk about I messages, like I
Yeah.
feel this way when
Mhm.
XYZ versus being, accusatory or attacking or you did,
Exactly.
because that changes how that person receives the
Mhm.
message. So what tips can you give to parents who maybe they're struggling right now, maybe they're not at a place where they can even go to counseling,
Right.
together to try to figure out how to work on their communication to co-parent. But what strategies or tips can you give when it
Yeah.
comes to communication?
I think number one, I love the I statements for sure. So being able to
Mhm.
know how to communicate with that. And again, it's not accusatory, but it's being able to say, this is what I feel, and then now we're having a conversation about it. But I think if you can, and if it's safe, being vulnerable, right? Having a conversation about what do we want this to look like? Because again, if our main goal is protecting, this child, these children, we want them to grow up happy and healthy. And one thing I had to realize, the happier that my child is when she's with that other parent, I want them to be happy, because that means my
Mhm.
kid is happy, right? So I want them to succeed. I don't want to, so having that conversation, but just maybe saying, you know what, it would really make me happy if we could once a year, maybe do a birthday together, or every couple of years, or,
Mhm.
if we could have something, or when they start going through puberty, let's sit down together, or how are we going to handle these things? So even just having that first conversation about, what do we want this to look like,
Mhm.
and then doing some type of peer mediation. I think family counseling is beautiful if they can, but
Mhm.
even if it's just having a conversation of, can your child see you guys sit down together, and can you all sit down together, again, even if it's just once, but
Yeah.
hey, all of these new changes are going to happen. And let's ask now the child, if they're old enough, well, what do you want this to look like? Even if
Yeah.
they're young, like, what are some things? But because I think we forget the little people in this
Mhm.
situation too, right? Of even if they're
Yeah.
little or not so little, they have these feelings and they have ideas about what they want it to look like. So can we bring them into the conversation as
Mhm.
well? I think just even those couple of things would make a huge transformation, on what those family dynamics look like.
Yeah, you're right about that because, and I kind of chuckled to myself because I was thinking about, so our oldest, they're 18 now, they'll be 19 in June. So,
Mhm.
and I'll say this, total disclaimer, I'm on a countdown to 2025, right? Because the youngest will be 16
Mhm.
in March. So in my mind, I'm like, huh, 2 more years. I don't have to deal with this. I
Yeah.
mean, I know there are other aspects that I'll have to deal with because hence the reason why I was in court until September. Because we've got to talk about who's paying for college. That's a
Mm.
different story for a different day. But I recall and children, they are very observant. It's just like when you're married, and there are some people who will remain married or remain in a relationship knowing that they're not happy and
Mhm.
doing it for the sake of the children.
Exactly.
And I grew up in an era where, my parents, baby boomers, but that's what you would see oftentimes with
Yeah.
that generation. I don't think it was until Gen Xers that we kind of felt that freedom to be able to make the decision like, I don't have to
Mhm.
stay in this type of relationship
Exactly.
where I'm unhappy just for the sake of, making sure my children or child has two parents in the house. But I remember when my twins graduated from 8th grade and we had these tickets, got double tickets because it was two.
Mhm.
And they wanted to go to dinner after graduation. And I remember my daughter asking, could her dad come along? And I was like, sure. And she was like, really? I said, yeah. So some of their friends were there. There were other family members there. I extended the invitation and I could tell that they were happy, that it was like they were tense initially because they didn't know, okay, is something,
Right.
gonna happen? Are they gonna be okay? But it was fine. Um, and then fast forward, but I felt like, to be honest with you, that I was the one who had to make the sacrifice in terms of, you know, extending the invitation. And because for me, I was doing it because I knew it was important for my
Right.
children. So I put my feelings
Mhm.
to the side because if I could have it my way, honestly, I'd be like, nope, we can do something separate. But I knew it was important to them. So sometimes it's also about making the sacrifice,
Absolutely.
putting your feelings aside for a moment for your child.
Yeah.
There is another time where my youngest, I remember her saying, I had to think about also how they interpret or internalize certain things that you may say. Not that you are bad mouthing the other parent, but maybe you are bringing something to their attention. So
Yeah.
I'm one who will talk about accountability, right? Um, so as a mom, if I'm sacrificing financially, making sure that you get everything that you need, but then not skipping a beat in terms of making sure that you still have these experiences, even though it's just one income here.
Mhm.
But as a child, you feel like I'm obligated or,
Yeah.
to do something. And I'll say, well, do you hold your other parent to the same level of accountability that you hold me?
Yeah.
And so I remember my youngest saying something along the lines of her dad, her dad is a part of her, or she's a part of her dad, or something along those lines. So I had to think about, okay, for this child, I have to kind of rephrase how
Yeah.
I say certain things, because she was internalizing if I'm asking a question as if taking it personally. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Wow.
So I had to, so there's some growth
Yeah. And that
on.
brings that brings up another good tip of we are sometimes so conscious of I'm not going to badmouth them, but we also don't ever take that intentionality to, kind of, for lack of a better word, good mouth them, praise them,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So it can do a lot of good for that relationship and maybe even for the communication, because if that child is then going to the other parent and talking about, oh man, mom was saying that you guys used to do this and she, loved that, or,
Mhm.
and even if it's not a reminiscent type thing, but maybe just, is there something I could praise them about, right?
Mhm.
To the child, because again,
Yeah.
you want them to have a good relationship with that other
Yeah.
parent, right? In an ideal
Right.
world, you guys would be doing this all together anyway. So you
Mhm.
want them, so there are ways that you can cultivate that relationship without them even being present.
Yeah. That's a great point too. And well, not I'm always asked about, did you all do XYZ? Like there are tons of pictures. One thing that I did, the pictures that we had together, like when we were dating, married, etc. Before, they have a photo album.
Mm-hmm.
They have access to it.
Yeah.
So like I don't keep it out, because obviously you don't want to offend
Right.
anybody if you've moved on, but they have access to that, because I
Mhm.
always felt too it was important for them to see that there was a point in time
Yeah.
in our lives where things
Yeah.
were good.
Yeah. But
And
they
so
came
that
out
they
of
could go,
love.
right, right. Because
Yeah.
I always say that was the best thing that happened in that 11-year marriage
Yeah.
were the children, so I think sometimes you do have to reflect on those things, but I not to sound like a pessimist, but I don't know. I got 2 more years to go, so I don't know if
Yeah.
we're gonna
Well,
ever.
and I mean, I hear you on that, but like you said, even after those 2 years, and so I look at parenting as a lifetime, right? Because
Yeah.
eventually, if my kids get married or something like that, then
Mhm.
we're gonna have to talk about that. We're gonna have to talk about
Right.
what is that, and again, I might also be an internal optimist, right? Where I'm just like, one day we are, because I'm thinking my daughter's in sixth grade, so I'm like, okay, when eighth grade graduation comes, are we all gonna go out to dinner? But
Yeah.
I'm already starting to think about how can I approach that conversation, So maybe in
Okay.
seventh grade, that might be a conversation I'm having, hey, next
Yeah.
year, I think it would be really nice to whatever we decide to do,
Yeah.
but just looking with intention of like, I knew when I had a child with this person, this was going to be a lifetime relationship, whether we were
Mhm.
together or whether we were not together. And if they're going to be in this, in my life for the rest of my life, then how do I want that to look, But
Mhm.
I also have a lot of power to dictate what that looks like, and
Right.
I can't control what they do. I can control me and the way that I experience this,
Yeah.
and so that's the keys, but it's a process, and that would be my encouragement to everybody, even if you're not there, if you see other people there,
Mhm.
it's a process. It doesn't mean you'll never get there. We have from now until we're called home to be able to
This is
determine
true.
what is this going to look like, right? And so all of us can
Mhm.
do is just go on the journey every single
That's so true. Let me change my
day.
language. And rather than say that I'm not trying to be a pessimist, I actually consider myself to be a realist based upon previous experiences.
I like that.
Let me change, because I know words have power,
Absolutely.
but it's so interesting. My daughters will talk about when they get married,
Hmm.
and they're like, "So how's this going to work?" And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I'm going to be there. I'm not going to let anybody stop me from being present. I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah.
So certain things that maybe they're worried about, I'm not like, I don't think of it like, oh, we've got to figure out because for me, we're not even at that stage yet. Like,
Right.
you've got to
Yeah.
finish school,
And maybe asking them,
far away.
well, what do you think you would want it to look like,
Yeah,
right? Because I think that's one of the things, and that's even how we equip our children with the power of like determining what their lives look like. Is like, you can look like whatever you want. I
right,
can walk you down the aisle if you want me to. I can
right.
whatever you really want it to look like. You can have two dads walk you down, whatever
Hmm.
that looks like. So really just being able to. But I love that they're having those conversations even now,
Yeah.
right? Because that shows you the wheels are turning about what do these relationships look like in my life.
Right, right. Yeah. And I've shared with them, like, regardless, I'm gonna always be present, be
Mhm.
supportive of you. So whatever you want,
Yeah.
I got you. So yeah, I think it'll all come, I don't know, full circle at some point,
Yeah.
whenever that is.
Yeah.
Now, do you with your and so we addressed the communications
Mhm.
piece. Are there any other tips that you think would be helpful for individuals who are entering into co-parenting space, or just trying to make sure that they're kind of starting off on the right track if possible?
Yeah. I think doing self work is so important. So whether that's with a therapist or whether it's individually, just taking kind of that honest assessment of where am I at emotionally, where am I at in my maturity level with this, how, because sometimes we all go through a petty phase, right?
Oh,
Where it's just
yeah.
like, look, I don't care what they do. I don't care. I know I'm petty and I'm just going, that's what
Yeah.
it is. But being able to be real with yourself
Mhm,
about wherever you're at in your healing journey is really
mhm,
important too, of being able to take that honest assessment of like, you know what, maybe I'm not ready to talk on the
mhm,
phone yet. Maybe I do just need to communicate via email or, we gonna write letters, whatever it needs to be.
mhm.
Doing that self-work, because again, that's not only going to make you a better parent for your children, but again, that effective co-parent as well.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, with your practice though, you only work with adults, correct?
So I do have some
Well,
clinicians who
personal.
work with, well, personally, I only work with adults, but I do have some clinicians who work with children as young as 12.
Okay. Okay. And so let's kind of you mentioned earlier
Mhm.
that you do have 10 clinicians, I think you
Mhm.
said. Right.
Yeah.
So let's say that we have a situation here where you have parents who may be going through a divorce, um, but they've decided that they want to go through counseling to kind of work. They're being
Mhm.
I'm going to say proactive in terms
Mhm.
of trying to establish
Yeah.
what co-parenting would look like. Would you recommend that uh, the child also go through um, counseling as well? And then within your practice,
Mhm.
if there were multiple clinicians in your practice who were seeing like the
Mhm.
parents and then the child, do you all kind of come together to kind of um, I don't know if this is
Yeah,
appropriate
I,
for me
I
to
do.
ask,
Yeah,
but
so we might have people who, so if a whole family was coming, so let's
Mhm,
say I would encourage them to do individual therapy if they can, right? So they might
mhm.
have an individual therapist, then they might have a therapist that works specifically with just the family. So maybe there's some
Okay.
sessions where the child will sit in, or it's just the two parents together talking about maybe some coping skills and things like that if the child isn't older or doesn't want to participate, whatever that case is. But I would suggest there's going to be a different therapist for
Mhm.
the individual and for the family unit. As
Okay.
far as we talk, I mean, we have team meetings that we do. So if there are any specific issues, I'm the clinical director. And so I might talk with them about some different interventions they might do and kind of provide some collaboration there. But we wouldn't necessarily like all, powwow about it,
Right.
unless there was an issue that came up that we needed to.
Okay. Okay. I was just curious about that.
Mhm.
Because I one of the things that I did, I was trying to be I guess proactive, and during that time,
Mhm.
I had my children go through counseling.
Yeah.
And I think it was, well, I would probably do things a little bit differently, but at the time, I mean, just as you learn more,
Yeah.
and then also having access to the resources. So during that time, I had an HMO. And so as you know, with HMOs, you're limited on
So
where you
limited.
could,
Yeah.
where you could go. And unfortunately, I'm going to say unfortunately, the three of them were going to their sessions together in one
Mhm.
session,
Mm.
but the clinician was not the clinician was Caucasian and a man.
Mm.
And I honestly felt like my children were running circles around him. I
Mhm.
think that they probably should have been, but they were maybe 6 and 9.
Okay.
But it was very interesting with the dynamics when they were in their sessions. And most of the time, I was in the session
Mhm.
with them. I don't know if it was because of the age, because they were so young,
Right.
but I was not participating. So I didn't say anything. I was just kind of off to the side and they were talking. And the things that they shared was quite amazing to me, but
Yeah.
it was more like they were having their own sibling chat session amongst
And he was
themselves.
just there
And
chilling, taking notes.
yes, taking
Yeah. I
notes.
mean, I think that speaks to a couple of different things, right? So obviously the healthcare system and the lack of
Mhm.
accessibility and all of that, and that's a whole different conversation.
Right.
But finding a good fit, because
Yeah.
sometimes people will get linked with a therapist and then they are unhappy and then they just stop. And I tell people
Mhm.
that you have to find a good fit, so a therapist is interviewing you to see if you're a good fit, but you have to interview us as well to say, like, that's what a consultation is for. If you aren't
Mhm.
getting a consultation, I highly suggest, ask one, say, I
Mhm.
don't want just a direct referral. I really want to take some time out and see, is this person a good fit? Because you can read a bio and it could look like, oh, this person is amazing, all that, and then you get into it and it's like they dry, they don't, and it's like, we just don't vibe, right? And you have the full license to say, you know what? Appreciate it. I think you're amazing, just not the best fit for me. And I'm
Right.
going to go and interview. But it can be really daunting, especially if this is your first time engaging in therapy,
Mhm.
and it's hard enough to make that first step. And then it's very easy to get discouraged if you don't find a good fit. But I always tell people just hang in there because there is somebody out there for you. So, please just try again. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think that it probably would have been amazing. Number one, had they had somebody who was a person of color, to be able to do that. But yeah, even just to be more engaging. And I think sometimes I'm wondering if there was some limitation that they had on the children of maybe they just need to sit and, they're not going to be able to engage as much as they obviously were.
Hmm. Yeah, it was quite an interesting time. And then it got to the point where my children were like, we don't need to go.
Because they were doing their own therapy. They're like, we could do this at home.
Yes. And it was, and I think during that time, it really it created a space for them, I think, to be honest about how they felt about certain things, because one would bring up a scenario and then the other, would talk about it. And without, I guess, disclosing too much, during that time, it was a situation where we actually, when we were divorced, we stayed in the same house together for an entire year
Mm,
after our divorce was final because he wouldn't leave. That's a, and I ended up a year later moving out
wow.
and kind of saying, hey, the movers will be here today. We're moving. Here's where we're gonna be. You can come see where I'm gonna have your children living.
Hmm.
And but then he immediately after we moved out, moved his girlfriend in.
Wow.
And that was problematic for my children.
Hmm.
And so that's what they spent their time talking about because they
Mm,
felt like to them, they felt like, well, that's still my mommy's house.
yeah.
You've moved, he moved somebody in and they didn't like the person either. So it was
Mm,
just, so it was
yeah.
quite interesting to listen
And those
to.
sessions were very, very interesting then.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they decided, you know what, we don't need this anymore. And so I think for the most part, they turned out to be well adjusted, but that's not to say that And because they know that I'm an advocate of therapy,
Mhm.
we talk about that a lot. I will say that my son is the only one who's just like, yeah, no, I'm good. But I think for him, that's because he lives in a house with all females.
Yeah,
So
please probably look. Enough feelings around me. I don't want to,
exactly.
hopefully that will change for sure. But I mean, there's, and even, it made me think of another tip for those, maybe if they're not ready to engage in therapy, but doing a kind of family journal. And this could be good for the co-parents, but also through for parents and children. I have this journal I use with my daughter. And it's sometimes if she is having a hard time wanting to sit down with me and have a hard conversation, then write it in the journal. And then we don't talk about it outside of there, but we can write back and forth to each other. And so that
Mm,
might even be a good way to communicate between households. So maybe it's like, I'm gonna bring the book over there. I'm gonna express some of
mhm.
my concerns and all that. But again, just keeping those open line of communication. But that could be really good, especially because I think one thing that children go through when their parents separate and all this is like they don't want to have to pick sides, right?
Right.
And they
Mhm.
also, they might have a very fierce loyalty to one parent versus another, right? But they feel like I still love them because they're still my parent. So being able to just give them a place to process that, but also a place for the adults in their life to respond as well.
Oh, that's so good. You're making some very valid points and things for us to think about.
Yeah.
I really like that. I love the family journal idea also. Um, so why don't we, I know we're kind of pressed for time now
Yeah,
at
we
this
had such good
point. So this is what happened,
conversation.
right? I was gonna say this is what happens when you're talking about stuff. You're having fun and lose track of time. But for those who tell me again the areas in which you specialize and then how people can find you. And
Mhm.
before you do that, I'm just curious. I know you mentioned that you do speaking engagements, you may have workshops, webinars, things of that
Mhm.
nature. Do you touch on topics such as, co-parenting, life after divorce, those type of topics with?
Absolutely. So the various events I do, it's pretty much just by request. So, if I have, whether it's a school or a church or, a mom's group or something like that might want me to come in and talk about specific things, then absolutely. If I feel that I have the expertise to talk about it, then I'm always willing talking. I mean, that's why I'm a therapist. Talking is one of
Right.
my favorite things to do. So absolutely. I've recently started focusing on faith communities. That's one of my
Okay.
really, it's my heart, especially because a lot of people, especially in the Black and brown communities, might go to their religious institutions first before a therapist. And so I really want to equip those religious leaders on here's some tools that you can use. I know you have a lot of really great training and you do some level of counseling, but let me equip you with some additional tools so that we can partner together and offer a open door to therapy too.
Okay. Awesome. So tell us, how can we find you? And then also the areas that you specialize in, again, just remind us.
Sure. So my specialties are working with couples, working with those who might have adjustment to any big life adjustment. So having a
Mhm.
baby, losses, divorce, marriage, things like that. Anything that you can think of that's an adjustment. Those are one of those things I specialize with. Mild to moderate depression, and divorce adjustment, things like that. And they can find me, Amaris Counseling LLC .com. That's where you can find the website. All of the therapist bios are on there, the different resources that we have. And so find there, and it is AMARIS Counseling LLC.com.
Perfect. And you do, I know you work with your clients virtually.
Mhm.
Do your other clinicians also, they're
They're
all
all
virtual,
virtual. Yep.
all
And so
virtual?
we
Perfect.
are currently hold licenses in the state of Illinois and Indiana. And then I also have a clinician who is in Tennessee. And so those are the states. I'm in the process of trying to get my Georgia license. So we can only work with clients who live in the states that we are licensed in.
Got it. Okay. Well, that is good to know. So thank you so
Thank
very much
you.
for taking time out of your day. I know we kind of jumped around just a little bit, but I would love for you to come back and be a guest on the podcast. We could talk about some other topics that
I
we
would love
didn't
to.
have time to talk about. So that'd be
Yeah.
great. All right.
Yeah.
So if you want to connect with Rachael Stewart, you can visit her website at Amaris Counseling LLC. That's AMARIS Counseling LLC.com.
Yes.
So thank you all for tuning in to this week's episode of Light It Up. Make sure you come back next week to see what interesting guests I will have on the podcast. And also make sure you share this episode with a family or friend, family member or friend. Geez. Until next time, make sure you continue to light it up and shine bright like a diamond. Thanks for joining me this week on Light It Up. Make sure you visit my website at www.lightituppodcast.com or www.aginahmuhammad.com. You can also find me on social media using the handle @LightItUpPodcasts. If you like what you've heard, please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, I'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or you can simply tell a friend about the show. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode. Until next time, light it up and shine bright like a diamond.